I'm Chiara, Sighele of Osservatorio Balcani, Caucaso, Transeuropa, which is a think tank based in Italy and collaborating since many years with the European Center for Press and Media Freedom. As we heard from the very first moment this morning, media ownership matters not only in terms of how concentrated it is, but also on how transparent it is. And we have seen also from the research done by the Media Pluralism Monitor that the lack of transparency of ownership is among the biggest obstacle to fight. And to fight also in terms of access to information in this regard for the public and for watchdog institutions. So I'm very glad and honored actually to have here with me this range of panelists. They are working on some of the most interesting, I think, projects in Europe, trying to track, investigate, map ownership of the media in Europe and beyond. So we will start with Olaf Steenfadt of Reporter Without Borders. He will introduce us to the Media Ownership Monitor, which is a global monitoring and advocacy tool to know who owns the media, who is behind the media. Then we will have Marius Dragomir of the Central European University in Budapest. His research team there is developing a tool to visualize and track changes in ownership in Hungary, in the media in Hungary, but it's hoped to be useful for other cases in other countries as well. Then we will move to Mary Fitzgerald of openDemocracy. They have launched recently a project called Open Media, which aims is to shift the focus on commercial interference in reporting. And then we will have Dr. Adolfo Antón Bravo of the Datalab here in Medialab, who could share with us some consideration about the situation here in Spain and what, in his perspective, can be done with data journalism in this field. So, Olaf, please take the floor.
Hello, everyone. Second try. This sounds much better. I'll just switch. All right, hello everyone. Thank you very much to the organizers for having me, and a quick tribute to my colleague and the president of our Spanish section of Reporteros Sin Fronteras, Alfonso Amada, sitting there in the back. Thank you for joining us today. Right, I think it's pretty much useless to introduce Reporters Without Borders to you. I think all of you have a kind of an idea who we are and what we do. Mainly, I guess, by means of our flagship project, which is the World Press Freedom Index, which we publish every year in May, and which basically reflects and illustrates the threats journalists are confronted with worldwide. Traditionally, these threats are mainly physical and legal. Basically, journalists get hurt or killed and jailed. But due to this work on the Press Freedom Index, we got an understanding over the last years that there is an additional threat which is maybe not so visible as physical and legal threats, but really taking up and getting more and more relevant for the work, and that is economic pressure, which really inhibits the independence of journalism a lot. And this understanding, in a way, was the starting point of the Media Ownership Monitor, a project which we started 2015, and which basically looks at the economic environment of journalism. Due to the understanding which we are trying to build as well inside our own organization, in which I can tell is also a bit of a shift of paradigms for Reporters Without Borders, that sustaining the independence of journalism really requires a healthy media landscape, and that means also healthy businesses. And if the businesses are failing, it's almost impossible to keep up the independence of journalism. And that, of course, relates a lot to ownership, which was already mentioned earlier and basically is the topic of the whole day. And our understanding is that any approach towards meaningful regulation of concentration of media ownership, on concentration control, of course, requires transparency in the first place. Now, everybody likes transparency, right? I mean, that's a nice buzzword everybody uses and calls for it. I'm mentioning this because we believe also a cautionary note is really needed at this point, because transparency, at least we believe, should never be an end in itself and should also have limits. And I'm saying this because if we look at media ownership and businesses in the media sector, our understanding while running this project, and I'll give you a quick tour in a minute, is that there are also legitimate reasons for corporate secrets in very competitive markets. And media, without any doubt, I guess, is a very competitive market everywhere. And this is also, we believe, something to talk about, that transparency should have limits. And of course, if you call for transparency like we do, you have to be transparent ourselves and explain what you do and how you do it. So this is basically, and this is not a PowerPoint presentation, so this is a live website, and the media ownership is not a report we publish that disappears in the shelves somewhere, but it's an online database, which basically goes country by country. So here you see on our global homepage quite interesting selection of countries where we've been so far. I believe 12 and counting. So our teams are currently underway in Albania and Mexico. And of course, the first question we always get is, how do you select these countries? We have basically 5 criteria. The first one is a mere technical one, because the funding comes from the German Development Ministry. And for that reason, we are limited to the so-called DAC list, which basically lists countries that are officially eligible for development aid. So we, for example, at least with this funding base, cannot go to Europe. The second criterion, which for me personally is the most important, is to find a credible partner organization in a respective country, which then, once we leave, carries on with the project and frequent updates of the databases. The third criterion is basically size of the countries. We might come back to this because this is really a methodological problem in a way. If a country gets too small, you might up in methodological glitches, because when it comes to risk indicators, in a country, say, of a population less than 1 million, you have concentration per se, so it's very difficult to measure and compare. And obviously there are also some other countries which are simply too big for our, for the resources we have. I'd love to do India, for example, but that's out of the question. The fourth criteria is basically safety. There are a number of countries where we simply cannot go. And the fifth criteria is, does it make sense? Because there's also a number of countries, I mean, North Korea, for example, our investigation would take 10 minutes because there's only one media owner, so they are also excluded. Right, so we can, for a quick tour, maybe pick, I would suggest Serbia because it's closest to where we are. But for each country, all websites look identical, so it doesn't make much of a difference. So when you look at the starting page, it looks very, I would say, simple. The reason is important maybe to notice. This is not targeting academia and us and ourselves as experts, but the general public as a contribution to media literacy. And for that reason, it's optimized for mobile. And also the language we use, and a really, really big emphasis on visuals, infographics also contributes to that target group. Here you see our partner organization, which in Serbia happens to be the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, and each and every country site is available always in English and the language of the respective country. So the main feature of every website is the database, where you can basically search for media outlets. So if you quick introduction, in this case.
Hay una pequeña presentación sobre el mercado de los medios en Serbia. Y a continuación se puede hacer una búsqueda más detallada en diferentes tipos de medios. Aquí en televisión, una visión de conjunto del mercado televisivo.
And approximately 10 largest TV stations in each country. per country we do 40 to 50 media outlets altogether, with the understanding that usually with this number we capture around 95% of the market. And then you can click on any and you get a profile, in this case of Pink TV, what it is all about, and of course most importantly the ownership structure, but also additional related data and all the sources that we used in this case. So because it is all interrelated, you can in that case click on the owner behind and you get a profile of him, and again all the stakes of both corporate levels as well as media outlets he owns, but also other related businesses, family and friends, whatever we manage to dig out in this regard. So this is the strand to search by media outlets. You can also go the other way and look for owners, either individual owners or companies, and you basically get a who is who of the respective country of the most eminent people in control of the media in a respective country. So this is more or less how the database looks like. Then we have a narrative part, which in each and every case features a context chapter, where we just very briefly describe the environment in which media operates in a respective country. For example, we commission a legal assessment, but really try to present it in a way that it is meaningful and understandable for each and every citizen. And as said, I mean, you can always switch to, in this case, Serbian and get it in the respective language as well. And then the second chapter on the narrative part is called Findings, where we first of all have risk indicators to media pluralism. And the color code is not by coincidence the same as the media pluralism monitor, which was presented in the morning, because we have synchronized our methodology with the MPM team, and we are not only using the same colors, but also the same methodology in computing and calculating these risk indicators to media pluralism. And maybe not so much for the general public, but for all experts interested, you can click on all these bubbles, and then you get a quite heavy explanation how each indicator is being calculated and how, you know, we come up with these colors. But then also there are a number of other articles, basically. I mean, it works a little bit like a journal of country-specific just topics we discovered. So in this case, for example, in Serbia, the state is obviously the biggest spender in the advertising market, with a lot of conflicts of interest, as you can imagine. So again, lots of infographics which fly quite nicely on social media, and of course, again, very importantly, all the sources related to it. Yes, so this is more or less what the media ownership monitor looks like. We will be adding 6 more countries, including Germany, by the way, not funded by the German Development Ministry, but by a different donor this year as well. And yeah, maybe I leave it at this point, and I think we'll have the opportunity to discuss later on. Thank you.
Thank you. This is us, yeah.
This thing of the monitors didn't work, so that is the reason I use my own.
It's fine. I think I can follow it there, but... Can you help? Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Marius Dragomir, and I am the director of the Center for Media, Data and Society. This is the Media Research Center of the Central European University in Budapest. I am here to present an ownership tracking tool that we are developing at the center. But before this is ready, just a few words to put that more into context. Basically, our work is focused on research into the media, and quite relevant for the meeting today, we launched last week our flagship project, which is called Media Influence Matrix. And basically what we are trying to do in this project, which is developed in a consortium with investigative journalists and research centers, is to make the links between, between regulators, owners, funders of journalism and technology companies. Part of that is this a small project which was developed by one of our fellows. This is not mine. This is not my presentation. Okay. So the tool that I'm going to present was developed by one of our fellows. His name is Attila Batorfi. It is funded by Google. And basically, what we are trying to do here is to become a bit more sophisticated in tracking ownership than looking just at the numbers. And I think we have a very special case, which is Hungary, a place about which I think you know already a lot. So basically, what is the problem with media ownership in Hungary? Back in 2010, when the current coalition won the elections, Hungary had the new Media Act that limited horizontal and cross-media ownership to avoid concentration based on audience share. That was a good set of legal provisions. The market players in Hungary seem to comply with the legal provisions and with these ownership limits. And at the same time, the law forced media companies to disclose their owners up to the first level of ownership. Of course, we know there is a problem there because of the beneficial ownership, but again, this was seen as a progressive move. At the same time, the media and the competition authorities in Hungary requested from media companies data for licenses and ownership analysis. Really, if you started to look and monitor ownership of the media companies in Hungary at the time, you basically found out that almost every actor complied with these legal provisions. However, it was not that. Can you hear me? It was not that simple. In fact, if you analyze the various mergers and acquisitions that were authorized by the media authority, you realize that some of them. No? Hello? Is it working? Okay. Yeah. Great. Thank you. So if you analyzed a number of mergers and acquisitions that were analyzed by the authorities, by the regulators in Hungary, you notice that some of them took many years to be approved, but in other cases they were suddenly approved, and especially large ones that actually posed more threats to competition were approved much faster than the others. Here we have just a case of two foreign media companies that tried to merge, and that was a deal that was not approved by the authorities, but then you had companies like MediaWorks and Panon Lapok, Radio 1 Network, Radio 1 and TV2 Group. All these deals were approved. So if you really looked into who was behind these deals, you found several names. You are probably not familiar with them all, but you have people like Lorenz Mészáros or Andy Vajna. People in Hungary and experts know that they are basically oligarchs very close to the party in government, Fidesz, and very close to the prime minister. So basically what I'm saying here is that if you really look at a number of deals, those that involve people close to the government were immediately approved. So basically what we are trying to do is to study that, and if you look at the number of titles in the print media, over 500 titles are that we have mapped as part of this project are close to the government. So what is happening? The conclusion was that when various projects of monitoring media ownership don't actually manage to get behind the ownership numbers, we see that regulation can't necessarily prevent propaganda and what we call ideological concentration. And then very importantly, the ownership caps which exist in the media don't in fact solve anything, don't guarantee necessarily pluralism. So what can we do? The model that we proposed for funding and the project that we are running now looks into the ownership and looks at a few elements related to ownership. One very important is the share of the market revenue. Very importantly, we added the share of profit into that. But also what is new is, and of course this takes a more qualitative analysis of the media market, is to try to also put into the equation things like left and right in terms of politics, how government-allied various companies are, how independent they are. Very important for this market, and I think also for other European markets, is the presence of these media companies in the rural versus urban areas. Is very important in Hungary, for example, who operates in Budapest and who operates on local level, what type of ownership is involved, whether it's Hungarian or foreign ownership. So the solution is this project. It is ongoing now. I won't go into the findings. We hope to start publishing in April, and for sure the final results will be available in June. The ownership tool that we are putting together in a cooperation with a number of experts from Hungary and the company that has access to all this data is a tool that helps monitoring and analyzing the Hungarian media ownership structure. This will be a network visualization tool that will offer a very simple, visually clear, easily understandable overview of the Hungarian market's concentration based on the companies on 4 elements, and they are the company, the financial elements, the interest group, and the audience. In this specific project, we don't go into the audience. We probably need another grant to do that. That's a totally different project. So we look at three aspects: the company-related aspects, financial, and interest group data. This is very boring. It's just an Excel, but it's very important because it's important to say that we are getting information about the 100 largest media companies in Hungary. Of course, there are many more, but it's important to say that these 100 companies together, jointly, they represent roughly 92% of the total market. You cannot map everything, but I think it's a very important and relevant sample. And also what's very important to say about this project is that it goes back to 1989. So basically it tracks the ownership changes over the past nearly 30 years. This is the design. This is what is in the making now. This is how we develop the clouds, and as you see, it's in the making. Some of the things are literally being written by hand. Readers and people interested in using the tool will be able to get in and click on things to find out and search for companies based on, for example, the local, the domestic ownership, the foreign ownership, the revenue, the profit streams, and so on. So basically, that's the tool. I just want to make 3 points about it. One is the fact that when we applied for that, and while we are developing that, we are thinking about the replicability of this tool, and it is replicable. It's very important to say that it's necessary to have, or it's easier to build this tool if you have available data, already scraped data. If you don't have that, you have to manually do that, which is not impossible, but it's a totally different type of project. The second thing is that we believe it is a more sophisticated look at ownership, in looking unveiling information and details about the leaning, the political leaning of various companies, and also very important in terms of technical terms is that once built, of course, if you build it on a platform that has access to data and information that a company is gathering, this tool is becoming automatically updatable. So basically it updates itself if it's connected to the right public registry or the sources of information. And finally, why is this important? I think it will be important, of course, not necessarily in the local context now, but generally in the policy context, because it can become a very useful policy tool when it comes to policies and legislation related to media ownership. Thank you.
Hello, I don't have any slides, but I'm going to stand here just to be like everybody else. So I'm Mary Fitzgerald. I run a website called openDemocracy. We are a global media platform. We publish in English, but also in a number of other languages. And our big thing since 2001, when we first started, is pluralism. We publish people we disagree with all the time. We try and bring perspectives from outside of our own filter bubble or echo chamber into our filter bubble and our echo chamber. We're read by lots of journalists, lots of activists, lots of media people, lots of policymakers and academics across the world, which is kind of a global elite. So we try and bring the perspectives from outside that global elite into it. And one of the people that we publish quite a lot over the years is a very well-known political commentator in the UK called Peter Oborne. He was, for a very long time, the lead political columnist for the Daily Telegraph, which is a very big paper in the UK. And he has a reputation, he's quite right-wing, quite conservative, but has done some fantastic journalism over the years and has a reputation as a bit of a maverick. And we published him for years because he would often come to us with stories that he couldn't get placed in other papers. And so we developed this relationship. And I think it was around probably late 2014, early 2015, he started looking at the role of banking and particular banks, particularly HSBC, in blocking money to organizations. One of his big themes is he's very anti-Islamophobia, and he sees that as a real problem on the right. And so he's often found standing up for the rights of Muslims. And so he was doing a story into how HSBC had blocked funds from a lot of the people who were involved in the charity relief effort to Gaza, to the Gaza Strip. And the prominent, well-respected people working in this charity relief effort had had their accounts frozen by HSBC. So he did a lot of investigation, and it led him to some pretty worrying places. And he went to his editors at the Daily Telegraph and said, here's the story, and they said, marvelous. And it didn't get published, and it didn't get published, and then it didn't get published. And after a while, it was spiked, and he never quite understood why. This happened with a few stories about HSBC over a number of months. Finally, he was told by somebody, taken aside by one of a colleague, and it was explained to him that HSBC is the advertiser you cannot afford to offend, and that actually an investigation into HSBC's activities, particularly helping rich people evade tax, had been shut down by the owners of the Daily Telegraph back in 2012. They brought in their lawyers and shut the whole investigation down and seized all the material around it. The owners, by the way, of the Daily Telegraph are tax exiles called the Barclay brothers, based offshore. So I can't imagine why they'd have an interest in that investigation. And Peter was horrified. He has great integrity as a journalist, and he decided that he would resign. But he thought he'd go quietly. He was just going to leave quietly and go somewhere else and do something different. And then SwissLeaks happened. I don't know if the lady from the ICIJ is in the room at the moment, but SwissLeaks happened, and obviously the offices of HSBC were raided in Switzerland, and all the major global media followed the story, apart from the Daily Telegraph. He waited day after day after day, nothing. And then finally on day 3 or day 4, a story about how perhaps it was all a bit, overblown, this SwissLeaks thing. At which point he completely lost his rag and called me and said, right, what are we going to do about this? He wrote, I went to his office on a rainy Sunday night in late February and helped him write his 3,000-word public resignation letter, which we published on openDemocracy, which broke our website because there was so much traffic, it just went off the charts, which people like Jay Rosen at NYU called the most important thing anyone's written about journalism in a long time. And he wrote about not only the Telegraph's relationship with HSBC, which he had excellently sourced, but about the Telegraph's relationship with a number of other commercial partners. You'd find stories, lovely puff pieces about the supermarket giant Tesco in the Daily Telegraph. You'd find a lot of rather questionable coverage about China in the Daily Telegraph at the same time as they were running a supplement funded by the Chinese government. So he wrote about all this stuff, and it made a big wave at the time, back in 2015. And as a result of that, lots of other journalists came to us and said, this is happening where I work, this is happening where I work. One of my friends called me and said, this is like phone hacking. It's the noise that's been going on in the background of my profession my entire life, and I've never really turned around and looked at it properly. We obviously wanted to do more stories about this, about all the allegations that were being brought to us. But of course, unlike Peter, who's an incredibly well-paid and well-known journalist, most of the people who were coming to us were scared for their livelihoods. They weren't going to talk about their employer or their former employer publicly. They weren't going to go public with this. They'd never work again. So we had this problem. How do we tell these stories? And how do we tell them in a way that's responsible without just bashing an industry which is already on its knees? Part of this problem is because of all the problems we've discussed and over the course of today, there is no revenue model which really works at scale. So we were thinking about it. One thing that I noticed after we published the HSBC story, some academics at King's College London, led by Martin Moore, looked at Peter's allegations, and they had built a particular form of media monitoring software called Steno, which was able to fact-check Peter's allegations by simply taking claims such as, there have been very few negative stories about HSBC over this period of time, and they were able to scrape all the media that was on the Telegraph website and prove empirically that that was correct compared with other major competitors of the Telegraph. So they were able to do quite a lot of analysis, which provided data which backed up his story. And I thought, well, hang on a minute. If we have other journalists coming and telling us things that they know, but they don't want to put their names out there publicly, can't we use this software to do the same about what they tell us? And then we don't have to, they're not risking their jobs, they're not risking their livelihoods, but we still have the story. So the brief answer from Martin was yes, we can. So we thought, okay, this is interesting. We started talking to Index on Censorship, and we started talking to the EFJ. I haven't seen Ricardo yet, but I'm sure he's in this room somewhere. Ah, yes. And we started thinking about how we could do this at some scale. And what happened then was we basically developed this project called Open Media, which is about investigating commercial interference in media. What I mean by that is wherever and whenever people or organizations or interest groups are using money to silence reporting, to skew or affect reporting, to edit reporting, to gain positive coverage, which is not labeled. And we are surveying journalists across 47 European countries, asking them a series of questions about where and how and in what ways this is happening. We've had hundreds of responses so far, and if it's okay, I would like to share the survey with all of you via email after this, because we're still collecting a lot of data. But there's some really interesting findings overall. The first is that sponsored content or native advertising, not labeled often. Positive coverage of advertisers, owners' corporate interests, often not labeled. Second of all, owners and ownership interfering in what gets covered and how and why and where. Not much of a surprise in many of you working in this room, but something that is very, very underreported. But we don't just want to find out what's wrong. As I said before, this is an industry, our media industry is already on its knees. We don't want to bash journalists and say how corrupt everything is, because that would be futile, it would be unhelpful, and also because I truly believe, I'm a journalist, and you know, any colleague you talk to, you ask them, what's a story you're most proud of doing? What's a story in your career that you're most proud of? They will talk about a story where they changed something as a result. And I genuinely believe, I may be naive here, but I believe most journalists know what the public interest is, want to write and produce stories that are in the public interest, and are often hampered and prevented from doing that by the pressures of the industry that we all now work in. So we thought, why not put that assumption of integrity at the heart of this project? And why don't we just not make it a project about investigating abuses or lack of transparency, but about advocating for solutions, advocating for how things can be done differently, inspiring journalists and inspiring readers to do things differently. So my colleague Martin, who invented the very clever media monitoring software, is also at the moment looking at a prototype for a plugin which allows readers and communities to identify what they believe to be sponsored content that isn't properly labeled. So a kind of wiki community gets together and goes, hang on a minute, this looks like it's Nestle sponsored or wherever else. You're involving readers in trying to spot sponsored content or native advertising where it's not properly labeled. If that takes off at any kind of scale, then you are creating demand amongst readers for transparency, which owners and outlets have to listen to. Martin's looking at another number of innovations in this space. There are already some great innovations out there where journalists declare all their income sources, and I think if that could be scaled, that would be very interesting. And there's a whole bunch of other things we're doing to try and make the positive case for why transparency over sources and transparency about information is a net benefit for your brand, you know, for your business. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it is, and so while we're gathering the evidence about where things are going wrong, we are planning to do a series of stories about it. We've done a few already, and there'll be a couple more in the next few weeks, so watch this space. What we are also really keen to do as part of this project is to make the positive case for change, for transparency, and for building trust between journalists and readers, between audiences and media owners and media outlets. So I think that's probably the summary. I would encourage you all to do the survey and share it widely, and I'll share it with you afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Actually, I think I want to pose my question, and I think I'll open the floor right after Adolfo Antón comments. But what I want to say is that what I think it's really interesting is in the 3 projects that have been presented so far is that there is, through different approaches, there is this common goal of working on these topics as a way of contributing to media literacy, which, as Olaf mentioned, I think it's really kind of one of the challenges is to raise a demand from the public for more transparency, for more knowledge around these topics, and engage in the discussion with journalists themselves, and to build room for journalists to mobilize and to regain trust from their audience and in their own profession. And what I also find interesting that all the 3 projects, actually, they are inspiring collaboration. Mary mentioned collaboration between audience and journalists, among journalists and watchdog organization. They all entail some collaboration between journalist association or watchdogs institution and academia, which I think it's a key aspect for this kind of project to be sustainable and able to allow for multiplication in the impact. And also you mentioned, Mary, the issue of advocacy, which I think it's something interesting to work on, trying to understand how to have these projects going on and becoming really a tool exploited by many different stakeholders. Also, in terms of advocacy, maybe to ask for better legislation or better implementation, also engaging the public in this. So, Adolfo, Antón, then it's your moment.
Lunch break. Hope. Here. Well. No. Vale. I didn't make a presentation, so it's okay. I can read my notes. Okay, I'm Adolfo Antón from the Datalab, Laboratory of Data, and we in Medialab-Prado organize two main workshops regarding data. One is about data journalism and the other about data visualization. And well, I think some of the topics that are on the table are very interesting, and I would like to show you some examples of this collaboration in between academy and journalists or newsrooms and the citizens. But well, later in Twitter or something, I will send you the links so you can later watch on. So there are, according to what you have been saying, like 4 main points I would like to say. One is about public media, the other is about law communication policies, the other is about history, and the last, and not the most important, but is what we do in Medialab, in the Datalab, is data. Okay, I will not talk about public media. I think some of you in the previous session have someone talk about the necessity of the public media, about policies. I think this is one of the most important topics, and one of the key topics in all of the news and data environment, because without policies we can't do anything, or we hardly can do things. And Spain is one of these, has some examples, like the transparency law. Before the transparency law in 2016, 15, we had to look for every data in PDFs, in images, and still we do. And I think the beginning of the good scenario is to have good policies. So I think advocacy in this case is very necessary, and it would be great if the European policies, or thanks to the European policies, Spain now is a little better than before. I would like to also to talk about some history moments, because when I listen to the speakers, I think about, or I remember at least, the McBride report, what I studied in the social science, information science school, or for example the agenda setting, or the fourth power theory, and I think I like to see and to see projects working in these topics, but I don't know if I miss the connection with the academic approach, or the essential of this is not this is only data. If we don't think about these topics that I said, these items. Just a few minutes about before this conference, I have met Ana Segovia, who I think is one of the best speakers for this panel, because she is investigating all this concentration and media ownerships, and I proudly had the opportunity to learn with the teacher that we both had, and I also had the opportunity to be in my school with Fernando Quirós or Paco Sierra, and I think we have to have the both approaches, the learn by doing approach, or please do connections in between media ownership, but don't miss the academic approach, how this was studied from a long time ago. And regarding data, the Datalab, the activities we do, I think I would like to point the linked data, because there are a lot of initiatives collecting data, spreading data, and all of them, when I see these projects, it's like, okay, this is like a report. What can I do with this report? Can I reuse this data? Can I get this data? Can I share this data with other people, with other sources? What is the source of this data? And that's something linked data solves for all of us, but it's not very spread in the world of information of the newsrooms. But there are some examples, good examples, like the BBC, the Guardian, the New York Times, and I think we have to take care of our data, not only for a good visualization, but also for the reusing of this data. And the last thing, I have also remembered the words of Simon Rogers from The Guardian. In a TED talk, he said that data journalism was the new punk, with 3 chords, with 3 sources of data, of open data. You could mix them and do something different, something new, something fast, something a different approach of the data that someone put on a table or a link. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Adolfo, Antón. Actually, I'd had some questions, but I'll keep it away, and I would allow first the speakers to comment, or maybe even before that, if you agree, we could see if from the audience there are some questions regarding the project that you presented. And so, yes, let's go first for the audience, and since...
Gracias. La primera para Mary. For you. He participado de vuestra encuesta y soy seguidor.
Okay, I have participated in your survey.
My first question is for you, Mary. I'm familiar with the work that you do, and I've seen your survey. So my question is because this afternoon the subject will be sure to come up. I'd like to ask for your opinion or your view of the regulators, the IPSO and IPRES. These are totally different. What solution can they give to this situation? And I also like to ask Fernando, when we're talking about academia and there's something missing after the presentation of the data, the academia is not doing anything to use the political projection of those data. At the end of the day, the data end up in a cloud unless there is a political project behind them to move forward with the data. As in the case of the UK, without a Levittson report, nothing would have ensued.
My speaker profile this morning because I realized that I hadn't declared a very important interest, which is that I'm on the code committee of IMPRES. So I'm not a neutral party on this question. I haven't joined IMPRES, and openDemocracy is not regulated by IMPRES, and there are complicated reasons for that decision. But I'm on the committee that advises IMPRES on the code that it should apply to the entities that it does regulate. For everyone else in the room, I suppose I should explain that there's this war going on in the British media at the moment between these two regulators. One of them is IPSA, which is basically the industry, big media sanctioned, weak, ineffective press regulator. And the other is IMPRES, which is new, which was something that came out of Leveson, and which, I mean, I think has stronger guidelines and has the potential to be more effective. But I think there are problems with both, to be honest. I get very nervous about there being any kind of state involvement in press regulation anywhere. And I mean, in the UK, I can see how the IMPRES model works, but if you apply that model to other places, it's dangerous. And I know that it's very arm's length, and I know that there's no system which is perfect. But you know, I lean towards freedom of speech and freedom of the press, even when there are some abuses, that happen, abuse of power that happens as a result of that. I just think you need to lean more in that direction. So I'm conflicted on the question of state involvement in press regulation. I have long conversations with myself and with other people about where we will sit. We definitely don't have a perfect system yet. But I joined the co-committee of IMPRES, which is the new organization, because I thought it would be a fantastic challenge to try and come up with a new code that regulated media outlets. And actually what's interesting about IMPRES is while some of the big outlets are with IPSA, some smaller, newer, kind of more interesting new media, local and hyper-local outlets are being regulated by IMPRES. And actually I think it's really interesting to see that one regulator is kind of serving that group, whereas the other regulator is serving the big group. I will say also, just on your other point, I think that I strongly believe that it's open media is perhaps an example of a project where you need to have all of these ingredients. You need to have the academia, you need to have the journalism, you need to have the advocacy, you need to have the activism, you need to have the political thinking. We are up against forces that are so much bigger than every single person and organization in this room. And you need to have collaborations between people and organizations with all different types of expertises. Communication is so important, and I feel like that's something that's kind of been neglected so far in what we've spoken about, although I'm sure it will come. Communication about our findings, really clear, easy to understand, sticky, memey, viral communication about this stuff. Otherwise, it's not going to reach beyond this room.
Just to say, we have 5 minutes, so I don't know if you can be quick, because I understood that he was addressing you, and maybe we can get one more question.
Quick. Bueno, la verdad es
I don't want to seem that I'm the representative of academia, quite the opposite. In fact, Datalab that certainly isn't an academic institution. We consider ourselves and we advertise ourselves as a citizens' laboratory where anyone can come in, can take part in the activities that we carry out in Medialab-Prado. So, after listening to the different presentations, I got the impression, not all of them, but I got the impression that there are things that I have studied and that seem that they have been kept in the ivory towers of academia and haven't got outside. For example, business models, about new types of journalism, rules and legislation that those of us who studied journalism when we studied it, these have to be used for something. It's not something that we need to study just to pass the exam and then forget about. We have to make it much more mainstream and make it much more public. That's why I was emphasizing that role of academia. I'd like to emphasize other projects too, because I've also lived through alternative news initiatives that had to fight with that battle. And we have to emphasize technological literacy. People use the web or the internet as a commodity, just as any other product. But while I was a student, we felt that the birth of the internet was wonderful, was amazing. But that infinite audience of the world takes it for granted. They treat it as something normal, and they think that Facebook is the only medium, Facebook or Twitter is the only medium, but there are other media that could be used, because there's a lot of free software out there, open software out there.
Okay, 2 questions. One is there, and one...
I have a comment, not that much a question. My name is Ivo Prokopiev, I'm a publisher from Bulgaria. I can confirm that in the last years we have been seeing increasing pressure from advertisers over the editorial content, and the fundamental reason for that is financial weakness of the newspapers and of overall media. It's very difficult for publishers and for editors to keep saying no, of mixing both, because if they say no, that automatically means somebody else shall cover the gap in the budget if the company is running on a loss. And advertisers unfortunately understand their increased bargaining power, and they use it more and more. Even reputable companies, international bank, large retail organizations, pressure is coming on that side, and it's very strong as well. In Eastern Europe, we have bigger problem, political pressure, which I will speak about in the third panel. But this advertising pressure is also there.
Thanks.
Hola, soy Ana Segovia. Le quiero agradecer.
My name is Ana Segovia. I would like to thank Adolfo for making a reference to Acamedia, I am a teacher at the Complutense University here in Madrid. I'd like to ask you two questions, one about the observatory and second about the tool regarding media ownership. So I'd like to know whether you have taken into account or included not only the effective ownership of media, but also the interconnections with other board of directors or interconnected directories. I mean, directories that are linked with the rest of the corporate world. So, because in recent years, we've been seeing clearer and clearer through these finance processes that are also reached the media. So we are not talking about the effective ownership of some visible owners that we can put a face to, but also the influence that can be made on media, as I say, through interconnected ownerships or through presence at the board of directors of large corporations or even the actual financial entities. That's another point, which is another aspect that has a strong impact nowadays on some of the questions that Marius mentioned. It's not only the concentration of ownership, but also concentration of ideology, which is much more difficult to fight.
Yeah, I can take this question. Just very quickly, in the project that I presented, we go as far as we can into understanding the ideological bias and the people close to governments, to political parties. I totally agree that there is more to do on that. And we have another project that I very quickly mentioned. It was not the space to present it here, but we do have another project that is run on a country-by-country basis, where we are trying to connect more or less what you are saying. And just to simplify for the purpose of this discussion, we are looking at three things there. One is the regulation policy area. So basically we are trying to understand the people and the key decision makers who regulate the media. The second is the layer of ownership and funding, who funds, who pays for the media, and this could be the group of advertisers, owners, whoever is involved, philanthropy sometimes involved in that. And then there is a layer of technology companies, and we know why they are important. They are important because they distribute media. So basically what we are trying to connect there is this level of ownership with people in these various parts of the game to see where the shifts, the major shifts of power are happening. So I totally think this is really important. We are trying to do that in a more qualitative research. It's very difficult to do it by just scraping data. So basically what I presented here, it's a small project, a prototype that we hope to develop into a bigger project, but that feeds into more research work. And just to build on, to respond quickly on a question before about policy and the academia, I think I represent the academia here. I'm coming from a university, and I'm very critical about my colleagues' work, because I have to be blunt and say that we are very ineffective in many cases. Some of our papers are downloaded sometimes by one reader. I was stunned to see these statistics. So I totally agree that there is a major push, there is a major need to actually link the academic work with the work of NGOs, civil society, and to the work of advocates. We are trying to do that as much as possible. The research that we are doing is not is run by academic institutes and research centers, but also we involve, we cooperate and collaborate with a lot of NGOs, networks of investigative journalists, and so on. Also, I want to emphasize the last point that I made about this project. It's really nice to have a visualization tool and to really see who owns the media and where is the power lying in a certain country. But one of the key reasons why I think that tool is important is its policy implication. I think these tools are really important as long as they have an impact in real life in changing policies and legislation at the end of the day.
Yes, maybe picking up the last point, in our project we define concentration in 4 different dimensions. One is the concentration within a sector, TV, print, online and radio. The second dimension is cross-media ownership across these sectors. The third dimension is along the value chain, so concentration involving also production firms, distribution networks, cable operators, for example, but also advertising companies, etc. And the fourth domain is what you basically, I think, have in mind is other interests in industries. And just to illustrate briefly, I mean, Turkey is, of course, an interesting case, to put it mildly, where there is no exception of national big media outlets owned by conglomerates which totally depend on government contracts in other sectors like defense, ports, infrastructure, construction, telecommunications, whatever. Now, if your main client is Erdogan, that doesn't need to be active censorship. I mean, people don't need to receive calls what to write or not to write if this economic, concentration and interests are so strong. And maybe a second example from Colombia, there is a case where one particular media mogul basically controls 2/3 of the television market, but is also invested in almost any other industry you can think of, including, for example, also beverages and beer, which then means that commercials for his soft drinks are run on his channels only and no one else. So I'm particularly not a big fan of Coca-Cola, but they do not have access to 2/3 of the Colombian television market as advertisers. And when we talk about advocacy towards politicians, this is also a strong point to make, that media concentration also impacts competition in other sectors and the economy at large, which I believe is a strong argument. Maybe one additional point very briefly, because so much was already mentioned as regards data. I mean, obviously our project is one of data journalism at the end of the day, which depends largely on the availability of data. A big surprise to our teams, no matter where they go in every country where we've been so far, is that at least we find it surprising that data of ownership is usually, I wouldn't exactly say easy to get, but at the end of the day, you will find out who's behind, one way or the other. What is not so easy to find is data on audiences, market data, basically. And if you want to have an opinion on concentration, you need audience data. Not only the availability of audience data is a problem, but in many, many cases it's being corrupted on a purpose. And this is, I think, maybe one entry point for regulation. Thank you.
I think, unfortunately, we have run out of time. So let's engage with the speakers during the launch, if they will allow you to do so. And thank you for your attention.